Why does life feel so hard? Why do you suffer? You try to do what's right, you try to trust God, but still the pain comes. And sometimes it feels like no matter how much you pray, no matter how much you believe, nothing changes. The suffering stays. The burden doesn't lift. And deep inside you wonder, has God forgotten about me? For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also aboundeth by Christ. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 5. But what if I told you that your suffering isn't proof that God has abandoned you? What if, instead, it's a sign that He is closer than ever? That He is doing something greater in your life than you can even see? That the pain you're experiencing is not meant to destroy you, but to shape you, refine you, and bring you into something deeper? That's not what the world tells you. The world says suffering means you've done something wrong, that if you were truly blessed, your life would be easy, that if God really loved you, He wouldn't let you go through this. But that's a lie, because even Jesus, the Son of God Himself, walked through suffering. He was betrayed. He was rejected. He was beaten and crucified. He suffered more than anyone else. If suffering was part of His journey, why do we think we should escape it? Spurgeon once said, "The Lord gets His best soldiers out of the highlands of affliction." Think about that. What if your struggles are not meant to break you, but to build you? What if the very thing you're asking God to remove is the thing He is using to make you stronger? Most people believe that suffering is just something to endure, something to get through as quickly as possible. But the Bible tells a different story. It says that suffering is not meaningless. It is not wasted. It has a purpose. And as much as your suffering increases, so does God's comfort. But here's the real question. If suffering is unavoidable, where do you turn for peace? Because the world has plenty of answers, but none of them truly satisfy. Some turn to distractions, hoping that if they stay busy enough, the pain will go away. Some turn to wealth and success, believing that if they just achieve enough, they'll finally feel secure. Others numb themselves with temporary pleasures, anything to escape the weight they're carrying. But none of these things bring real peace, because peace is not found in escaping suffering. It's found in knowing that, even in the middle of it, God is right there with you. Most people think suffering is a sign that something is wrong, that if they're struggling, it must mean God is punishing them or that they've made a mistake. But what if suffering isn't a curse? What if it's a calling? Throughout the Bible, the people who walked closest with God were often the ones who suffered the most. Job lost everything. Joseph was betrayed and thrown into prison. David spent years running for his life. Paul was beaten, shipwrecked, and thrown in jail. And yet, through all of it, they found something that most people never experience, a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. Jesus never promised that following Him would mean a life without suffering. In fact, He warned us of the opposite. If the world hate you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. John 15 verse 18. The world teaches that pain is something to be avoided at all costs. That comfort is the goal, that struggle means failure. But Spurgeon once said, God does not make His children strong by letting them sit in ease. He builds them up through the storms. And isn't that the truth? Think about the times in your life when you grew the most, when your faith became real, when your prayers became deeper. It wasn't in the easy seasons, it was in the hard ones. Yet even knowing this, most people still resist suffering. They try to run from it, to fix it, to make it stop as quickly as possible. And when they can't, they start to wonder, where is God? But what if I told you that your suffering is not a sign of God's absence, but of His presence? That He is not punishing you, but preparing you. That even in the moments when you feel the most alone, He is actually closer than ever. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Hebrews 13 verse 5. So why do we doubt? Why do we struggle to believe that even in our hardest moments, God is still working? Maybe it's because we've been trained to measure God's love by how easy our lives are. If things are going well, we assume He is blessing us. If things are falling apart, we assume He has turned away. But that's not how God works. God's love isn't proven by the absence of suffering. It's proven by His presence in the middle of it. And once you understand that, suffering no longer feels like the end of the story. Instead, it becomes part of something greater, something that is leading you into deeper trust, deeper faith, and deeper peace. When suffering comes, most people's first instinct is to try to escape it. They look for a way out, anything that will make the pain stop. Some drown themselves in distractions, work, entertainment, endless scrolling, anything to keep their minds busy. Others chase after money and success, thinking if they can just achieve enough, the emptiness will finally go away. And some simply give up, convinced that life will never be more than hardship and disappointment. But none of these things bring real peace. At best, they numb the pain for a little while. But as soon as the noise stops, as soon as they're alone with their thoughts, the suffering is still there. Because the world can only offer temporary relief, but God offers eternal peace. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11 verse 28. Spurgeon once said, "There is no university for a Christian like that of sorrow and trial." That's not something most people want to hear, because suffering hurts, it's uncomfortable, it makes us question things we thought we knew. But that's exactly why God allows it, because suffering strips away everything false. It removes the illusions we build for ourselves, the things we think will bring happiness but never do. It brings us face to face with the only thing that really matters, our trust in God. Think about it. If your peace is based on things going well, then what happens when everything falls apart? If your faith is strong when life is easy, but crumbles when trials come, then was it ever truly strong to begin with? That's why suffering is not just something to endure, it's something that reveals what's really in your heart. Do you trust God even when you don't understand? Even when the prayers go unanswered? Even when the pain doesn't stop? Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Isaiah 26 verse 3. The truth is, peace has never been about avoiding suffering. It has never been about creating a life without hardship. Real peace, the kind that cannot be shaken, comes only when you put your trust completely in God. Because then, no matter what happens around you, your heart remains secure. No matter how strong the storm, you know the one who controls it. So the real question isn't, how do I stop suffering? The real question is, where is my peace coming from? Because if it comes from the world, it will never last. But if it comes from God, nothing can take it away. That's the difference between the peace the world offers and the peace God gives. The world's peace is fragile. It only exists when things are going well. It depends on circumstances, on everything falling into place just right. But God's peace is unshakable. It doesn't depend on what's happening around you, it depends on Him. I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Lord, only makest me dwell in safety. Psalm 4 verse 8. But here's the problem. Most people say they trust God, but deep down, they still try to control everything. They hold on to their own plans, their own solutions, their own way of doing things. And when life doesn't go according to plan, they panic. They feel anxious. They wonder why they can't find peace. But how can you have peace when you're still trying to hold everything together on your own? Spurgeon once said, "When you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head." That means peace comes not when you understand everything, but when you trust the one who does. It means believing that even when life feels out of control, God is still in control. But here's the truth. Real trust is only proven in suffering. It's easy to say you trust God when life is comfortable. It's easy to have faith when everything is going your way. But what happens when trials come? What happens when the storm doesn't pass as quickly as you'd like? My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. James 1 verses 2 and 3. That's not an easy thing to do, is it? To see suffering as something that strengthens you instead of something that destroys you. But that's exactly what God does. He takes the very thing meant to break you and uses it to build you. The very pain that was supposed to take you down becomes the thing that lifts you up. But this only happens if you surrender, if you stop fighting for control, if you choose to believe that your suffering is not random but part of something bigger. Because the truth is, God is not absent in your suffering. He is working through it. So the question is, will you keep trying to handle it all on your own? Or will you finally let go, trust God, and allow His peace to fill you, even in the middle of the storm? That's the hardest part, isn't it? Letting go, trusting God completely, not just when things make sense, but when they don't. It's easy to believe God is in control when life is good, but real faith is tested when everything seems to be falling apart, when the prayers feel unanswered, when the suffering doesn't stop. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness. Isaiah 41 verse 10. That's God's promise. Not that life will be easy, not that suffering won't come, but that you won't walk through it alone. And yet, so many people still feel abandoned in their pain. They still feel like God is distant, like He isn't listening. But could it be that our suffering isn't proof of His absence, but an invitation to trust Him deeper? Spurgeon once said, "The furnace of affliction is not meant to burn you up, but to refine you." That's not an easy truth to accept, because no one wants to go through the fire. No one wants to be tested. But what if the fire is where your faith becomes real? What if the suffering you're experiencing isn't meant to destroy you, but to draw you closer to the one who holds your life in His hands? The world teaches us that suffering is meaningless, that it's just something to endure. But God never wastes pain. He uses it to transform us, to shape us, to strengthen us in ways we never could have imagined. For thou, O God, hast proved us. Thou hast tried us as silver is tried. Psalm 66 verse 10. Silver is only purified by fire. The heat burns away the impurities, leaving behind something stronger, something more valuable. And that's exactly what God does with us. He doesn't allow suffering because He is cruel or distant. He allows it because He sees what we cannot, because He knows that on the other side of this trial, there is something greater waiting for us. But here's the real question. Will you trust Him in the process? Will you believe that even when life is painful, He is still good? Or will you let suffering make you bitter, make you doubt, make you turn away? Because in the end, suffering does one of two things. It either pushes you away from God, or it pushes you deeper into His arms. And the choice is yours. That's the real test of faith, isn't it? Not whether you believe in God when life is good, but whether you trust Him when life is hard, when the suffering is deep, when the prayers seem unanswered, when the storm doesn't pass as quickly as you had hoped. The world tells you that peace comes when your problems go away, but God's peace is different. It's not about removing the struggle, it's about sustaining you through it. It's about knowing that even in the middle of the storm, even when everything seems uncertain, you are held. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4 verse 7. That's why some people can go through the most intense suffering and still have joy. It's not because their pain is any less real. It's because they know where their peace comes from. They know that their suffering is not the final chapter, that God is still working, that He is still in control. Spurgeon once said, "I have learned to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock of ages." That's a radical kind of faith. A faith that doesn't just endure suffering but embraces it, knowing that God is using it for something greater. But most people never experience that kind of peace, because instead of surrendering, they fight. Instead of trusting, they resist. They try to hold on to control, to force their way out of the suffering, to fix things in their own strength. But the more they fight, the more exhausted they become. Because peace doesn't come from striving, it comes from surrender. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth in thee. Isaiah 26 verse 3. So maybe the real question isn't, why am I suffering? Maybe the real question is, where is my focus? Are you looking at the storm, or are you looking at the one who can calm it? Are you focused on your pain, or are you focused on the God who promises to bring you through it? Because suffering will come, that's a guarantee. But how you go through it, that's a choice. You can either let it consume you, let it steal your joy, let it shake your faith, Or you can choose to trust, choose to believe, choose to fix your eyes on the one who never changes, never fails, and never lets go. And when you do, you will find something the world can never offer, a peace that doesn't make sense, a rest that no suffering can steal, and a strength that only comes from knowing you are never alone. That's the hardest part, isn't it? Shifting your focus from the suffering to the one who holds you through it, because pain demands attention. It screams for answers. It makes you question everything. And if you're not careful, it can consume you. It can make you believe that suffering is all there is, that life is just one hardship after another with no end in sight. But that's not true, because suffering is not the destination, it's the journey. And God never allows His children to walk through the fire without a purpose. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Romans 8 verse 18. Spurgeon once said, "Our troubles have always brought us blessings, and they always will. They are the dark chariots of bright grace." Think about that. What if your suffering isn't a punishment but preparation? What if the very thing that feels like it's breaking you is actually making you stronger? That's what most people miss. They see suffering as something to escape, something to survive. But what if God is using it to shape you, to refine you, to prepare you for something greater? Because the truth is, suffering isn't random. God is intentional. He never wastes pain. He never allows hardship without a reason. And while you may not see it now, one day you will. One day you'll look back and realize that the thing you thought would destroy you was the very thing that strengthened your faith the most. And ye now therefore have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart shall rejoice, and your joy no man taketh from you. John 16 verse 22. But here's the problem. Most people never reach that moment, because instead of leaning into God's presence, they let suffering push them away. They let their pain make them bitter instead of better. They let their trials shake their faith instead of strengthening it. And that's exactly what the enemy wants. He wants you to believe that your suffering means God has abandoned you, that your pain is meaningless, that your struggles have no purpose. But that is a lie. Because the very thing the enemy wants to use to destroy you, God is using to build you. So the real question is, which voice will you listen to? The one that tells you to give up, to turn away, to believe that your suffering is pointless, or the voice that says, "Trust me, I am with you, I am working, I will not fail you"? That's the battle, isn't it? Not just the suffering itself, but what you choose to believe in the middle of it. Because every trial brings a choice. You can let it pull you away from God, make you bitter, make you doubt, make you feel abandoned. Or you can let it push you deeper into His presence, into a faith that is stronger than ever before. But most people don't see suffering that way. They see it as something that just happens to them, something unfair, something they have to endure. But God sees it differently. He sees the bigger picture. He sees what this trial is producing in you, what it's shaping in your heart, what it's preparing you for. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. James 1 verses 2 and 3. Spurgeon once said, "The Lord gets His best soldiers out of the highlands of affliction." Because trials don't just test your faith, they refine it. They show you what's real and what is. They strip away everything false, everything shallow, everything that cannot last. That's why some of the strongest believers aren't the ones who have had easy lives. They're the ones who have walked through fire and come out the other side. The ones who have suffered but still believe. The ones who have lost much but still trust. Because they've learned something that most people never do, that God is not only present in suffering, but He is using it for a greater purpose. For Thou, O God, hast proved us. Thou hast tried us as silver is tried. Psalm 66 verse 10. But here's what most people don't realize. The way you walk through suffering will determine what comes out of it. Because suffering changes you. It will either make you harder or softer. It will either draw you closer to God or push you further away. So ask yourself, what is your suffering doing to you? Is it making you trust God more or making you doubt Him? Is it making your heart softer or making it colder? Is it pushing you to pray more or making you shut God out? Because the suffering itself isn't the end of the story. The real story is who you become through it. And if you let Him, if you truly surrender, if you stop fighting for control and trust the process, God will use this season to prepare you for something greater than you can even imagine. Because suffering is never the final chapter. With God, there is always something greater on the other side. So what if this suffering isn't a setback, but a setup? What if what feels like the breaking point is actually the turning point? What if, instead of running from the pain, you leaned into God like never before? That's the choice in front of you. To let this suffering make you bitter, or let it make you stronger. To let it steal your faith, or let it deepen it. To let it pull you away from God, or push you closer to Him than you've ever been. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Jeremiah 29 verse 11. God has not abandoned you. He is not punishing you. He is preparing you. He is shaping you into the person He created you to be. But you have to trust Him. You have to believe that this is not the end of your story. That He is working even when you don't see it. That He is faithful even when life feels unfair. Spurgeon once said, "When God puts His children into the furnace, He keeps His eye on the clock and His hand on the thermostat. That means He knows exactly how much you can handle. He knows the purpose behind every trial, and He will never leave you alone in the fire." The enemy wants you to believe that your suffering means God doesn't care, but the cross says otherwise. The cross proves that even in the deepest suffering, God is working for something greater. Jesus suffered beyond what we could ever imagine, but through that suffering came salvation. Through that pain came victory. Through that darkness came the greatest light the world has ever known. And if God could bring that much good out of the suffering of His own Son, what makes you think He won't do the same in your life? For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also aboundeth by Christ. 2 Corinthians 1 verse 5. So here's the question: will you trust Him? Will you choose faith over fear, surrender over control, belief over doubt? Will you let suffering push you away from God, or will you let it bring you closer than ever before? Because at the end of the day, you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to understand every trial. You just have to know one thing: God is with you, He is for you, and He will never fail you.